When you hear the brand Neo Geo, your immediate thoughts may drift towards fighting games in the arcade, or perhaps the excellent Neo Geo AES home platform, the Rolls Royce of games consoles in 1990. What an insane beast that was, but today we will focus on something much smaller and pocket-sized, SNK's range of Neo Geo handhelds. That's right, in the late 90s, SNK wanted to expand their horizons and attempt to compete against Nintendo's, by that point, aging Game Boy. So join me today as we discuss the launch of these things, what they brought to the table, and some of the exciting games they have to offer. How much fun could you have with these little SNK machines? Let's find out. So with all that said, I am Lady Decade, and this is the story of the Neo Geo Pocket Color and ultimately why it failed. Regarding handheld gaming in the 1990s, everyone could tell you that one definitive handheld dominated the market: the simple yet iconic Game Boy. Since the original Game Boy was released with the legendary Tetris title in the West, Nintendo's budget platform with a 4 shades of green display was the high mark for all gamers on the move. This did not mean that others would not try to challenge the Game Boy's supremacy though, with some early efforts offering up some physically wonderful competition. Atari would challenge Nintendo with their Lynx, NEC would make a literal portable PC engine with their PC Engine GT, and Sega would put up a valiant fight for years with the Game Gear. However, in due course, Nintendo still found the handheld market ripe for the picking. Not only was the Game Boy significantly cheaper than its competitors, equipped with full color displays, but the battery life lasted significantly longer due to its simplicity. Add Tetris and Super Mario Land into the mix, this quickly led to rapid Game Boy sales. With the speed at which the hardware sold with Tetris, it was not long before it had a superior gaming library to all of its contemporaries. By 1998, the Game Boy was 9 years old, and thanks to the second wind of popularity that the success of Pokemon had provided it with, Nintendo handheld sales were still strong. With the PC Engine GT, Sega Game Gear and Atari Lynx long doomed by this point, one competitor would throw their hat in the ring by the time the century was wrapping up. But to understand why SNK would join the handheld market, we first have to look at their past leading up to this point. Over the late 1980s and early 1990s, the arcade developer SNK would pioneer an innovative way to handle new releases in the competitive arcade marketplace. While the standard method of releasing new arcade cabinets to businesses would have to be an entirely new machine released, SNK would embrace the exchangeable cartridge model. The Neo Geo multi-video system brought new levels of convenience to arcade owners. With a relatively powerful chipset and simple cartridge concept, several arcade titles could be swapped on the fly or even installed simultaneously, giving mall rats a variety of games to play that they couldn't even imagine seeing at home. Well, unless you were rich and could afford the Neo Geo AES home console, of course, but let's talk about the average gamer. For most people to play SNK games at home, they would eventually make it to other home platforms, usually the Famicom, PC Engine, Mega Drive and a Super Famicom. With this, there would obviously be a fair amount of limitations induced on them. Notably, characters like Earthquake and Samurai Shodown were either entirely omitted or largely shrunk in stature when brought to the 16-bit consoles, and games like Art of Fighting had to find a workaround for their innovative zooming in techniques. But for the handhelds, a few of the titles would find their way to the Game Gear and Game Boy, but would basically be full reinventions for the platform, as there's no way Nintendo or Sega's limited devices could genuinely handle the power, and frequently being outsourced to another third party wouldn't have SNK micromanaging the port. With the home console and arcade markets wrapping up their era of dominance moving into 3D graphics. SNK decided to look at 3 different avenues. One would be reinventing the wheel, with the polygonal gaming-based Hyper Neo Geo 64 going for arcades, Neo Geo CD trying to trim costs at home, and the topic of today's video tackling the portable market. Advanced 2D gaming in the arcades and at home, which had been SNK's bread and butter for years, was no longer on vogue, so the company would need to diversify its product range if they wanted a hope in hell of continuing to survive in modern gaming. Sadly, SNK's 1994 product, the Neo Geo CD, failed to meet the company's expectations with its high price point and slow loading times, putting many consumers off. Pair this with its limited library and competing consoles launched that year, such as the Sony PlayStation and Sega Saturn, it did not have much of a chance really. The Neo Geo CD at launch was already outdated compared to its competitors. The Neo Geo CD struggled to gain widespread popularity and market share, leading to its ultimate failure within the gaming market. As for the Hyper Neo Geo arcade hardware, things were not any better. SNK's 1997 leap to producing polygonal arcade games did not go as planned, with their titles paling compared to those being put out by Namco and other successful arcade giants. Very few Hyper Neo Geo games were produced, and it was only a matter of time until this endeavour was concluded too, meaning a lot of hope was being pinned on the Neo Geo handheld, the platform they would produce to compete with the aging Game Boy. Finally, in 1998, SNK developed and released their monochrome machine, the Neo Geo Pocket. While only offering up monochrome graphics for a handheld console of its time, the Neo Geo Pocket boasted impressive hardware capabilities. Its 16-bit CPU and Toshiba TLCS900H core allowed for smooth gameplay and relatively detailed graphics, especially compared to the Game Boy. With a uniquely square 256 by 256 black and white screen, like Nintendo's latest Game Boy variant, the Game Boy Pocket, it too ran on 2 AAA batteries but would add a CR2032 for backup memory and clock functionality. The Neo Geo Pocket's form factor was relatively compact and comfortable, making it easy to carry around and play. Its size and weight made it a portable gaming option for fans who wanted to enjoy their favourite games outside their homes. The system's much lauded directional pad would replicate the Neo Geo CD's controller instead of being a simple membrane pad like you see on the Game Boy. If you haven't held one of these, it's an attempt at bringing the clicky nature of arcade joysticks with a circular pad with micro switches, and by many accounts one of the most solid digital pads that are revered to this day. Even 8BitDo, producers of retro-inspired controllers, have worked with SNK to replicate this in modern controllers for modern systems. The control scheme feels that damn good. In the features department, like the Game Boy, the Neo Geo Pocket's link cable allowed for a good multiplayer experience. Players could connect to Neo Geo Pocket devices using the link cable and enjoy head-to-head gameplay or trade items and characters in compatible games, a wise feature considering the success of Pokemon recently. On top of this, SNK designed the Neo Geo Pocket to connect to the Sega Dreamcast of all things. A Dreamcast connection cable would provide a bit of an odd bedfellow, connecting the two 1990s juggernauts on their way out of the hardware business. 6 titles would take advantage of this, with 4 being the Dreamcast releases of the Capcom vs SNK and King of Fighters games, allowing point transfers, character unlocks and more to reward players who have explored SNK's Pocket library. Despite including lots of promising design elements, to a large degree the Neo Geo Pocket was dead on arrival and thus only released in limited regions, never reaching the United States or even countries favourable to SNK's fighters like Brazil. With weak sales, the console would only see 10 titles, primarily split between sports, fighters and puzzlers. King of Fighters R1 and Samurai Shodown would represent fighters on the console, surprisingly porting the frenetic action to the handheld. Despite these quality fighters, the Neo Geo Pocket would have less than half of the Virtual Boy's library. So what was going so wrong for SNK? Was the Game Boy just that much more popular? Well, kind of. Nintendo would learn about the Neo Geo Pocket and notice that it was shaping up to look like a cool handheld. With Pokemon making handheld gaming white hot again in Japan, they did not want SNK gobbling up any any sizable chunk of the market share. This would mean one whole week before SNK's new monochrome handheld hit shelves, Nintendo would finally release the Game Boy Color, the full color version of the Game Boy that gamers had fantasized about for nearly a decade. Suddenly, the Neo Geo Pocket had zero chance of succeeding. This meant that the only chance SNK had of competing with Nintendo would be to rush back to the drawing board and make a color version of their new handheld, and to be fair, do that they did, with the latest hardware being ready as quickly as just 5 months later. In 1999, SNK revised the system with color capabilities, rapidly iterating the Neo Geo Pocket Color. This handheld console would be released internationally on a wider scale, starting on the 16th of March in Japan, the 6th of August in the USA, and 1st of October in Europe. Thankfully for those few who had rushed out and purchased the original model, despite the system's limited library, the Neo Geo Pocket would be able to play many of the color games that came later, with the original Pocket being forward compatible with the bulk of the future library for its immediate successor. This revision would feature AA batteries, and beyond the graphical improvements by adding the much needed color, it would play and have the power of the original. The console would launch with 14 titles, already besting the predecessor's library, with huge heavy hitters arriving such as iconic titles like Sonic the Hedgehog Pocket Adventure and SNK vs Capcom The Match of the Millennium. For the United States, the console would launch with 6 titles exclusively on eToys.com for $70 in 6 colors: Camouflage Blue, Carbon Black, Crystal White, Platinum Blue, Platinum Silver, and Stone Blue. Soon after, the revision would be advertised on TV and sold in Walmart, Best Buy, and Toys R Us. Sadly, despite the Neo Geo Pocket's future showing some promise, SNK as a company had become extremely sick by that point. The Neo Geo CD, Hyper Neo Geo 64, and original Neo Geo Pocket were all missteps. With their older arcades becoming less and less relevant, the company was in deep financial trouble. With the business collapsing, SNK would need to be purchased by American pachinko manufacturer Aruze in January of 2000. With Aruze buying SNK out, the console would be recalled to some extent in June 2000, repurposing many of the units in the Asian markets, alongside stripping much of the packaging and bundling 6 games in a blister pack. This would also lead to an accidental exclusive release of the title Facile and The Last Blade, which were otherwise not released in the States. They would end up being released in the UK though, meaning they would have English translations. Eventually, a third version of the handheld, the new Neo Geo Pocket Color, would slim the device at a 6,800 yen price point for Japan, with this version being around 13% slimmer than the older model, but there were no significant changes otherwise. But before we dig any deeper into this system's lifespan, let's review some key games that can be enjoyed on the Neo Geo Pocket Color. As touched on earlier, one of the significant titles available on the system is SNK vs Capcom Match of the Millennium, a crossover fighting game developed by SNK featuring characters from both the SNK and Capcom universes, bringing together the iconic characters from games like Street Fighter, King of Fighters, Samurai Shodown, and others. If that's not significant on a handheld, I don't know what is. At its release, the game was well received by critics and fans alike due to its impressive roster of characters, smooth gameplay, and the nostalgia of seeing characters from 2 beloved companies pitted against each other. It offered a variety of game modes, including a story mode, versus mode, and a mini game mode, adding to its overall appeal. There were loads to do on this one, offering something completely different from what you could get on the Game Boy. A particularly famous Neo Geo series was the Metal Slug games, and thankfully the Neo Geo Pocket Color had some to call its own. These games offer nostalgic gameplay, and fans of the Metal Slug series will appreciate the familiar run and gun action and arcade style fun. The controls are well optimized for a handheld console, making it easy to maneuver and shoot enemies with various levels and challenges, keeping you engaged throughout the experience. Whether you are playing Metal Slug First Mission or its sequel Second Mission, you don't get more SNK than these. Speaking of franchises heavily associated with SNK, how about King of Fighters? KOF R2 was first released in 1999 as a sequel to King of Fighters R1 and features a similar 2D fighting style with simplified controls to suit the Neo Geo Pocket Color's limited button layout. The game includes a roster of characters from various SNK fighting games, including the King of Fighters and Fatal Fury, among others. In KOFR2, players can choose a team of 3 characters and battle against other teams in a tournament-style setting. Each character has unique moves and abilities, and players must utilize various combos and strategies to defeat opponents. The game was well received by critics and fans alike for its impressive graphics and gameplay, making this a most owned game for anyone's Neo Geo Pocket collection. Sonic the Hedgehog Pocket Adventure is a part of the iconic Sonic the Hedgehog franchise. It features the fast-paced adventures of the titular character Sonic and his friends as they try to stop the evil Dr. Robotnik from taking over the world. I don't know why I'm explaining what Sonic the Hedgehog is to you, but it's too late, I just did. The game follows the classic 2D platformer style that the Sonic series is known for. The game was developed for the Neo Geo Pocket Color to help showcase the capabilities of the handheld console and offered a portable Sonic experience for fans post the failure of the Sega Game Gear. While the game is not as well known as some other titles in the Sonic series, it received positive reviews for its faithful recreation of the classic Sonic gameplay and for being a solid addition to the Neo Geo Pocket Color's library. So give it a go if you get the chance. Another classic fighter for the Neo Geo Pocket Color is Samurai Shodown 2. It's a portable adaptation of the original arcade game, aiming to replicate the experience of the home console version on a smaller scale. The Neo Geo Pocket Color version of Samurai Shodown 2 retains the essence of the arcade version, featuring a similar roster of characters, the signature moves, and the weapon-based combat system. Despite the limitations of the handheld hardware compared to the arcade, SNK managed to deliver a satisfying fighting experience on the NGPC. Now, when we consider that the main reason the Game Boy range was so popular in the late 90s was due to the success of Pokemon, then the logical thing to do would be to make a game that has a few similarities to it, but for the Neo Geo Pocket Color. And that is exactly what Dark Arms Beastbuster 1999 is about. In this game, players assume the role of a character who discovers a mysterious wristband known as the Dark Arms. This wristband can capture and control monsters. The main objective is to use the Dark Arms to capture various monsters and utilize their powers to defeat enemies and progress through the game. The gameplay features a mix of action and role-playing elements. Players will explore different environments, battle various monsters, and unlock new abilities by capturing different creatures. As the story unfolds, players face challenging enemies and bosses, leading to an ultimate showdown with powerful adversaries. When you look at the gameplay, it's not much like Pokemon, but you can certainly see some thematical elements are similar. Card Fighters Clash is a classic collectible card game that revolves around players assuming the role of a card fighter, dueling against opponents using decks of cards featuring characters from popular games. Each card represents a character or item with specific abilities, attack and defense points, and other attributes. The gameplay involves strategically assembling a deck of cards, considering their abilities and synergy, and engaging in turn-based battles against other players or computer-controlled opponents. The goal is to reduce the opponent's health points to 0 by attacking with cards, using special abilities, and defending against incoming attacks. Card Fighters Clash had 2 versions, SNK vs Capcom Card Fighters Clash and SNK vs Capcom Card Fighters 2 Expand Edition, adding more games to the stellar selection of Capcom SNK crossovers that are available to experience. The Last Blade Beyond the Destiny is part of the Last Blade series, a popular fighting game franchise known for its unique gameplay mechanics, beautiful 2D graphics, and compelling storylines set in a fictionalized version of Japan during the Bakumatsu period. Players can choose from a roster of diverse characters in the game, each with their own fighting style and special moves. The gameplay features a smooth animation and responsive controls, offering an enjoyable fighting experience on the handheld platform, further building on the Neo Geo Pocket Color's extraordinary fighting game pedigree. These are obviously just some of the great games that can be enjoyed on the Neo Geo handhelds, with plenty more amazing experiences available to unearth and discover. Ultimately, with SNK featuring financial woes and needing to compete with the smash hit Game Boy Color, the Neo Geo Pocket Color never lived up to sales expectations. The Game Boy Color had a massive library of games, a strong brand presence, and widespread popularity, making it challenging for the Neo Geo Pocket Color to gain a significant market share. Despite some great games, the NGPC's game library was relatively small compared to its competitors. The lack of a diverse and extensive game lineup was a significant drawback for potential buyers, as gamers tend to choose consoles with a wide range of game options. A further issue that hindered its success was that SNK's Neo Geo brand was primarily associated with arcade and home console gaming, not handheld devices. Nintendo's Game Boys, on the other hand, had built a reputation as a reliable and successful handheld gaming platform. The Neo Geo brand didn't have the same recognition in the handheld market. Compounding falling behind further, SNK's marketing efforts for the Neo Geo Pocket Color were not as aggressive or widespread as Nintendo's. Additionally, distribution channels were not as expansive, limiting the console's availability in some regions. With more powerful handhelds like the WonderSwan Color arriving in 2000 and the Game Boy Advance hitting shelves in 2001, the Neo Geo Pocket Color's window to succeed was extremely small anyway, but that doesn't mean there still isn't a reason to celebrate this now obscure platform today. History now shows us that the Game Boy was known for many genres, but outside of a limited Street Fighter port, the best fighters on the monochrome handheld were produced by Takara and based on SNK fighters. Even in 2023, tributes to this concept, the super deformed yet technically incredible fighter, would come in the form of Pocket Rumble. This game wears its Neo Geo Pocket Color history on its sleeves. And that's not the only Neo Geo Pocket reference on modern consoles. Recent ports of the Neo Geo Pocket Color Selection Volume 1 and 2 have brought large swathes of the console's library to modern devices, so we can enjoy some of the system's undersung classics on more recent platforms. As for the handhelds of old, though, only 2 million units were sold by the end of the era and across all versions. Arusa would purchase the manufacturer in 2000 and they'd immediately end the international distribution of the console shortly following for the domestic Japanese market. This would kill the previously announced sequels to Magician Lord and Ikari Warriors, leaving the console under 100 titles across all regions and ending with SNK vs Capcom Card Fighters Clash 2 Expand Edition on the 13th of September 2001. So while there is plenty of reason to revisit and celebrate the Game Boy, while it was ultimately a failure, the Neo Geo Pocket Color was pretty cool too. If you enjoy learning about obscure old hardware, watch my 2-hour video on the weird world of Nintendo add-on consoles. See you next time.